In 1628, when Central Europe was all aflame in the 30 Years' War, and Catholic and Protestant forces were busy fighting for power and religious righteousness, in the North Italian town of Mantua, a struggle for succession and inheritance between some minor dukes drew the mightiest powers of Europe into a conflict they all wanted to avoid. A conflict that included besieging an island, heavily fortified and under unintentional quarantine. This was a conflict characterized by political intrigue and complex family entanglements. We disentangled them and present you a simplified yet comprehensive analysis of the Mantuan War of Succession. Contemporary historiography tells this intriguing story as follows. On the 22nd of December 1612, peace turned into turmoil in the small Italian duchy. On this day, Francesco IV of Mantua passed away. His dynasty, House Gonzaga, had ruled the Duchy of Mantua since the 14th century. House Gonzaga had even managed to extend its rule to Montferrat through clever marriage politics in 1531. But then, Francesco Gonzaga turned up his toes without a male heir. He only left a daughter, Maria. His two younger brothers, Ferdinando and Vincenzo, had both joined the church and lived in celibacy. They, one after another, took over the duchy, but neither of them secured the male succession. The insecure succession in Mantua sparked the hopes of another player. Duke Carlo Emanuele I of Savoy now entered the stage. He was Francesco's father-in-law and claimed Montferrat for his own house. He tried to get hold of it by force and thereby caused the War of the Montferrat succession, also known as the First War of the Mantuan succession. Because the Montferrat fortresses held strong, he failed, but according to the historian R.A. Sterling, he managed to enforce an agreement that Maria shouldn't be married without the personal permission of the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Quite unusually for the time, Maria was eligible for succession. This was due to a precedent, which meant Montferrat could be inherited along the female line. If anyone defied this agreement, this would bring the Emperor Ferdinand II into the arena. In 1626 and 1627 respectively, Francesco's two younger brothers passed away, and the main line of the House Gonzaga finally went extinct. On the same day, the head of the oldest side branch of the Gonzaga family ascended to power, Carlo Gonzaga, better known as Charles of Nevers. According to the historian David Perrett, it would have been normal in such a case to negotiate an arrangement taking into account other claimants too. However, Charles wouldn't have that. Quite the opposite, he went all in and arranged a marriage between his son and Maria, of course without imperial consent. Two of Charles's rival claimants now entered the stage. First, and for a second time, Carlo Emanuele, Duke of Savoy, who still claimed Montferrat on behalf of his daughter, the widowed wife of the late Francesco Gonzaga. Second, the Duke of Guastalla, Ferrante II. Ferrante was only a distant cousin of the Gonzaga family. His duchy was right next to Mantua and very tiny, but he could count on the support of the Emperor Ferdinand. These new developments enlarged the political scope of the conflict immeasurably. Besides the Emperor Ferdinand of House Habsburg, Spain, the other great power, ruled by the Habsburgs, and the Kingdom of France now also had an interest in the two duchies. Neither Spain nor France wanted to join this conflict, because they were already occupied on various fronts and battlefields. France, on one hand, in its own lands, fighting the Huguenot rebellions. Spain, on the other hand, was still busy fighting the Dutch. However, none of them could afford one of the others to gain full control over northern Italy. All this led to an Italian stalemate. Because Charles of Nevers stubbornly refused to arrange himself with the other claimants, the Spanish governor of Milan, Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, eventually saw himself forced to open negotiations with Carlo Emanuele of Savoy in December of 1627. This was because he feared Savoy would gain full control over the Duchy of Montferrat. Savoy had proven loyal to France in the past, So if Savoy controlled Montferrat, that would have meant to yield it to the French. Therefore, he and Carlo Emanuele agreed to invade and divide Montferrat. Carlo Emanuele would finally get what his family had always claimed, and Cordoba would get the extensively fortified city of Casale, along with some territory to present to the Spanish king. The two armies of Cordoba and Carlo Emanuele marched into Montferrat in late March of 1628. While Carlo Emanuele's Savoyard army successfully occupied the parts allocated to Savoy, Cordoba was having a hard time. Contrary to his expectations, the city of Casale didn't strike the flag when his small army showed up. Subsequently, he deceivingly claimed he was carrying a letter signed by the Emperor Ferdinand, who demanded that the city opened its gates to Cordoba. However, the defenders had the audacity to request to see the letter, which of course was entirely made up by Cordoba to gain access to the city. This was enough to make his temper run away with him. Commanding cannons forth, marching men towards the walls, he laid siege on Casale. Although Cordoba received reinforcements in summer, the city showed no weakness until the leaves turned brown and autumn approached. While Savoy and Spain were interested in Montferrat, but not in Mantua, Ferrante of Guastalla was. He turned towards the imperial court for help. Although the emperor didn't want to participate in the conflict, in the end he had no other choice than to act. Charles of Nevers had directly disobeyed him by marrying his son to Maria without imperial consent. So the emperor demanded that Charles of Nevers would lay his territories in the hand of an imperial custodian for the time being. But Charles disobeyed the emperor again. He levied troops to intervene in Montferrat, but his army disintegrated before they got even close. Charles then turned to the King of France, Louis XIII, who now feared an advantage of the Spanish-Savoyard alliance in Italy. On 5th of March in 1629, the French, under personal command of Louis XIII, routed the Savoyard force at the Pass of Susa. All of a sudden, the weakened Carlo Emanuele of Savoy changed sides and agreed to assist the French in relieving Casale. When Cordoba learned about this, he had no other choice but to abandon his siege. The French, mission completed, returned to France for the last campaign against the Huguenots. The city of Casale, however, remained under French garrison. The first siege of Casale had failed. The Spanish, of course, couldn't accept this French advantage on Italian ground, and the war in Italy became their foremost political interest in Europe. Cordoba was replaced by Ambrosio Spinola, a Genovese veteran experienced in siege warfare. He received full resources to take Casale. Under his command, the second siege of Casale started in May 1630. In addition, the Spanish king eventually convinced Emperor Ferdinand II to send troops against Charles of Nevers. As a result, the imperial army prepared to support the cause of the Spanish and marched towards Italy in the summer of 1629. The imperial troops brought not only reinforcements into the Spanish camp, but also the plague into Italy. The Duchy of Mantua's first line of defense was the river Oglio, a subsidiary stream of the Po. Although this natural frontier had been reinforced by earthwork, it hardly withstood the enemy's attack. On the 19th of October, imperial troops attacked several positions along the Oglio, while cavalry units crossed the river and swept away the defenders on the other side. Because the imperial soldiers had turned the enemy's flanks, only few defenders were able to retreat to Mantua. The city was already well prepared for a siege, not only because the Dukes of Mantua had steadily reinforced and modernized the defenses for the last century, but also because Charles of Nevers had ordered all citizens to work on new earthworks designed by the expert engineer Francesco Tensini. They were intended to reinforce existing fortifications on the Isola del Te and at the Predella Gate on the city's western side. Also, workers demolished buildings in the suburbs so that they couldn't be used as cover by potential intruders. The siege of Mantua began in the first week of November, when the explosion of several barrels of powder caused chaos among the defenders. The attacking army forced a crossing onto the Isola del Te. On the island, the imperial troops dug trenches towards the newly built earthen outworks. But only shortly after the trenches were opened, the attackers realized they were in trouble. Because of the high groundwater level, the trenches filled with water so that they couldn't advance any further. The siege guns of the imperial army were positioned on the eastern bank of the Mincio River. From there, they couldn't bombard the city effectively, because they were too far away. Only few unlucky defenders were killed. Unaware of this, the imperial army prepared itself to launch an attack over the San Giorgio bridge. Flags flying and drums beating, a deep column of German soldiers stormed over the bridge towards the gate near the Giardino bastion. In the meantime, the defenders prepared an ambush on the city end of the bridge. A small band of soldiers positioned 2 cannons so they could fire along the bridge and loaded them with musket balls. When the attackers were at close range, they fired. This instantly swept away a large number of men on the bridge. The Mantuan chronicler Scipione Capilupi notes morbidly, quote, "A great quantity of Germans died from these shots, and for some days they left the bodies on the bridge, not daring to remove them because they feared the 2 guns." End quote. After this second failure, the imperial army turned towards more cautious methods. They reached for their tools again and built a dam downstream of the city in order to dam the Mincio River. The water level rose, drowning the Mantuan mills, which subsequently became ineffective. Although their granaries were well supplied, the inhabitants of the city now feared starvation, because the grain couldn't be milled to make bread. In one of the following nights, a detachment of 40 soldiers rowed down the stream in small boats and destroyed the dam, so that the water could flow and the mills mill again. Now the besiegers decided to simply wait the city out. In the city, the situation became gradually worse, especially because it housed a lot of refugees from the surrounding countryside. The first thing that ran out was fodder. This led to a distorted situation. While meat sold for extremely low prices, hay became outrageously expensive. Animals were slaughtered before they could starve. However, as the winter of 1629 intensified, the Mantuans received support from an unexpected ally. The plague brought to Italy by the imperial soldiers caused more damage in the ranks of the attackers than the food shortage harmed the people within the city. Shortly before Christmas, the imperial troops retreated and took winter quarters at the banks of the Oglio. However, what seemed to be a relief initially would ultimately lead to the Mantuan doom. The defenders left the city, destroyed the imperial earthworks, and reinforced their own. But the relief of the siege did not only allow the Mantuans to leave the city, it also allowed the plague to enter. The siege had effectively functioned as an accidental quarantine for the Mantuans. In May, the imperial army returned to Mantua and resumed the siege. The plague now raged in the city and decimated the defenders during the next months. By mid-July, the defenders were weakened to the point that they hadn't much to set against an imperial assault. Mantua fell without much struggle. While the attackers brutally plundered the city, Charles of Nevers managed to retreat to the Porto Fortezza citadel. Only 2 days later, he surrendered on generous terms. After the loss of the city, the cause of the Duke of Nevers seemed lost. He took horse for exile in the Papal States. But well aware of the greater politics of the time, he knew his claims for the duchies of Montferrat and Mantua remained alive as long as Casale held out. The troops of the Spanish under Ambrosio Spinola had taken position in front of the city in early May in order to wrest the stronghold from the French. However, this time the plague weakened the besiegers, and Casale held out until summer, when French relief forces advanced towards the city. Before it came to an armed confrontation, however, politics took over, and after long negotiations, Spain backed down. Most of Montferrat and Mantua was restored to Charles of Nevers in the 2 treaties of Cherasco in 1631. The French kept Casale and another key stronghold. Hence, they reinforced their position on the contested Italian ground. Both the emperor and the Spanish king had gained nothing but lost much. The war had been a Habsburg catastrophe.